Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes topical questions, and we will now move on to the next item of business. The next item of business is a statement by Angela Constance on Scotland's prison population. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. I would remind members that we are quite tight for time this afternoon, and therefore I would expect succinct questions and succinct answers to match. And I would also expect that the statement should last no longer than 10 minutes. And I call Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance.
Presiding Officer, throughout my tenure as Justice Secretary, I have taken significant steps to both strengthen our justice system and to address the rise in prison population. I have also proactively kept Parliament up to date on this critical issue and any proposals and measures we are taking, alongside clear explanation as to why I believe these were necessary. In November 2024, this Parliament agreed to modify the release point for certain short-term prisoners so that they are released after serving 40% of their sentence rather than 50% of their sentence. This change is projected to result in an approximate 5% sustained reduction across the sentence population of short-term prisoners compared to if no change had been made. The Scottish Prison Service has further optimised capacity in the existing estate to create 400 additional spaces compared with 2024. We have also increased SBS capital funding to £355 million this year, with £458.5 million allocated next year to support construction of 2 new prisons. HMP Highland, due for completion in late 2026, will provide 107 additional places, while HMP Glasgow, expected in 2028, will add 357 places. We have also significantly increased investment in community justice, bringing the total funding for this year to £159 million. And this investment enabled expansion of the availability and the use of alternatives to custody. In 2024-25, 1,500 bail supervision cases were commenced, the highest in 10 years. Electronically monitored bail also remains high, with 1,470 cases recorded over the year. Use of community payback orders has grown too, with 16,500 CPOs commenced in 2024-25, a 9% increase in 2023-24, and the 5th highest total in a decade. In November 2025, Parliament approved a further emergency release of certain short-term prisoners. This measure included important safeguards to protect the public and victims, and we have worked in close partnership with the NHS, local authorities and the third sector to provide additional support upon release to facilitate successful reintegration into communities. We have completed 4 tranches of emergency early release, with 415 prisoners released to date, which is lower than expected. There are further 3 tranches planned until April, which are estimated to result in a further 100 to 200 prisoners being released. The action taken by this Government has been necessary to ensure the safe running of our prison estate for those in prison and, importantly, also for our hard-working staff. All these measures couldn't have been successfully implemented without the hard work of the Scottish Prison Service staff, Justice Social Work Services and a range of other partners, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their dedication and commitment. Presiding Officer, despite the best efforts of this Government and our delivery partners, the prison population remains stubbornly high, and the current trajectory indicates that this upward trend will continue. Today, the prison population is sitting at 8,301. As of 27th January, 8 prisons are showing red risk status and 15 are being close to or over their assessed capacity tolerance. The continued rise in the prison population reflects the action we have taken to strengthen the justice system. For example, the number of homicide victims in 2024-25 was the lowest since comparable records began in 1976, and recorded crime rates remain among the lowest in more than 50 years. However, at the same time, we are seeing more convictions for serious and organised crime, as well as for recent and historical sexual offences. This is testament to the work of Police Scotland and our courts, which also reflects a confidence in reporting sexual offences, knowing that this will be taken seriously. Sentencing patterns have also changed, with considerably more people being sentenced for longer. The average custodial sentence length has increased by 37% between 2014-15 and 2023-24, a significant contributor to the growing number of long-term prisoners serving 4 years or more, and one that cannot be predicted. Presiding Officer, this means that, as well as having an increased and increasing prison population, the composition of our prison population has also changed considerably, and together this creates significant risks for those who work and live in our prisons. These risks cannot be underestimated, and the projections are clear. The emergency release provides only a temporary relief and therefore will not reduce prison population pressures to a safe and sustainable level on its own, and further action is therefore required. Presiding Officer, that is why, alongside our work to prevent crime, expand prison capacity, reduce reoffending and strengthen alternatives to custody, which I am clear must all continue, I believe that additional changes to the automatic release point for certain short-term prisoners are now necessary to deliver a further sustained reduction in the prison population. Following careful consideration of the options available to me, I would therefore like to notify the Parliament of my intention to carry out a short consultation with relevant partners on this issue, with the aim of laying secondary legislation next week for Parliament's approval. This is necessary to meet standing orders on SSIs and ensure that the regulations can be scrutinised ahead of Parliament's dissolution. This consultation will seek views on changing the automatic release point for certain short-term prisoners so that they serve 30% of their sentence in custody instead of 40%. This would not apply to those serving sentences for domestic abuse and sexual offences. Unlike with emergency early release, this change would deliver a reduction that would be sustained over time. Presiding Officer, protecting victims and public safety remains an absolute priority for this Government. Let me therefore stress that the proposed changes would not apply to those serving long-term custodial sentences over 4 years, or those serving sentences for domestic abuse and sexual offences. This recognises the particular concerns that can arise in relation to those offences and the considerable progress which has been made in recent years so that victims and survivors can have confidence in the justice system. Presiding Officer, let me make clear this is not a decision I have taken lightly. It remains crucial that those who pose the greatest risk of harm to the public are housed in prisons. However, it is also the case that there are too many people in our prisons, and like the rest of the UK, we remain an outlier amongst Western nations in this regard. Whilst this measure is required in the immediate term, we must look beyond that to a sustainable long-term position, which reduces reliance on custody and makes use of robust community alternatives. The Sentencing and Penal Policy Commission, which I established last year, is set to publish its recommendations in detail, and its recommendations will be published shortly, and I will return to Parliament following the publication. We know that community sentences are more effective in reducing reoffending than short-term prison sentences, which disrupt families and adversely affect employment opportunities and stable housing. Managed release processes are therefore an important and a recognised part of our justice system. They support meaningful rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Those leaving prison after a short-term sentence in Scotland are entitled to request through care support, which is provided through their local authority, a third sector organisation or the National Voluntary Service Upside. These services provide flexible and personalised support before, during and after release. They help prisoners access support to find somewhere to stay, find a job and healthcare. We have seen that this can support successful reintegration and contribute to reduced risk of reoffending. less crime, fewer victims and safer communities. This is what we all want to see. Presiding Officer, to conclude, I believe that this action is necessary and that the proposed exclusions I outlined strike the right balance between recognising the concerns of victims and survivors while supporting a sustained reduction in the prison population, which is essential in enabling our prison estate to function safely and effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which time we will move on to the next item of business. It would be helpful if those members who would wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons. And I call Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement. Presiding Officer, criminals get up to 4 years for things like drug offences, serious assault and possession of offensive weapons. There was a time when a sentence of 4 years meant 4 years. For years, though, that became automatic release at the halfway point. Since February 2025, these prisoners were let out after serving only 40% of their sentence. In the last couple of years, we've also had several so-called emergency release programmes. Presiding Officer, in December 2023, the prison population was just under 8,300. Today, it's just over 8,300. Presiding Officer, the government's knee-jerk, unevidenced, panicked schemes have failed. And the Cabinet Secretary has come here today talking at length about her inputs. But in just 2 paragraphs, we learn the only outputs will be hardened criminals, after just 30% of their sentence. So, Cabinet Secretary, what research was done that demonstrates 30% will be any more successful than previous failed schemes? Has the Cabinet Secretary changed the previous failure of government to keep any formal records of risks, objectives, rationale on prisoners released early? And in previous similar statements, the Cabinet Secretary focused on protections for victims. In this one, she does no such thing. Doesn't that clearly show where this government's priorities lie?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, with the greatest respect, I'm not going to take any lessons on supporting victims from a member who did not support the most recent Victims Bill. In terms of his trip down memory lane, it is, Presiding Officer, it is almost a quarter of a century since I worked in the prison service, and at that point short-term prisoners were automatically released at halfway through their sentence. What I can say to Mr Kerr, because his point about demonstrating outcomes is important, and in terms of the wide range of actions and steps that I have taken, we can, of course, demonstrate the impact of that directly or indirectly. And if I can give one example of that. So after the implementation of the STP40 programme last year, what we've seen in terms of the short-term prisoner population between February and November, that it reduced by 8%. There are other examples that I can give. But what he needs to recognise that while the government can take steps to manage the population, and one of the reasons, because we look closely at the detail, is that we know that the current early emergency release programme is lower than expected, and that's because of higher inflows than expected into the system over the festive period, and also the use of the Governor's veto. But the key thing here, Presiding Officer, is that we all have to step away from our rhetoric and appreciate and look at the evidence and understand why Scotland is such an outlier in terms of having an exceptionally high prison population, because it does not, irrespective of the rhetoric, it does not serve our communities and people well to have an overpopulated prison service, because that is contrary to achieving good safety in our communities.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I will need briefer answers. Polly McNeill.
The prison system has been in a permanent state of crisis for some time, and it's not rhetoric to say so. Every few months we come to the Chamber to hear a statement about more offenders being let out early on one scheme or another. It was just over a year ago when the Parliament agreed to change the release date for short-term prisoners from 50% to 40%, and today we've been asked to move that further to 30%, with only a short time to consult on it. Where does this end for victims who will be alarmed that some offenders will only now serve 30% of their sentence? I asked the Cabinet Secretary today for full transparency and detail on the crime profile of those offenders who will now be eligible for permanent early release if this further reduction in time is implemented. So what type of offences will they be committing, if you like? Because I think the public deserve to know what that looks like.
Presiding Officer, as I said in my statement, the offences that will be excluded are those prisoners who are serving a prison sentence of less than 4 years for domestic violence and sexual offences. The member will be well aware that there are a wide range of other offences, but it's also beholden on us to deliver a sustainable prison population, because that is in the interest of the health, safety and welfare of staff, but also in terms of the communities that we serve. And the advantage of looking at the automatic release point for certain prisoners is that that will give us a sustainable reduction. I do also have to say to Ms McNeill that what we are wrestling with in Scotland is not unique to Scotland. And indeed, there is similarities of the action taken in Scotland and that south of the border. Now, I do not say that to demur from my responsibilities, but also by way of context. We know the Tories released 10,000 prisoners early without a higher eye to parliamentary accountability. We know that the Labour Party had continued with that scheme until their current measures kick in. We know that the UK Labour
Cabinet Secretary, I have asked really for succinct answers. That really isn't one at this point. I'm sorry, but I appreciate it's an important matter, but we've got a lot of members who really would like to be able to ask the question and get an answer. I call Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Sharon Dow. Mr Hepburn.
Thank you, President Officer. The 37% increase in the sentence length that the Cabinet Secretary mentioned merits some further examinations. Presumably this, if it's an ongoing trend, will contribute to an increased prison population. Can the Cabinet Secretary set out what research or analysis the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service might have undertaken to better understand why this increased sentence length is occurring?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'm not aware of that, but the increase is shown in statistics. The trend over the past decade is driven by a range of factors. In some part, that reflects the action that we've taken to strengthen the justice system. For example, we're seeing more convictions for serious organised crime and recent and historical sex offences. We also continue to see the number of those sentenced to short-term sentences that remains high. And as of the 2nd of February, yesterday, there were 1,928 short-term prisoners, which is about 23% of the entire prison population.
I call Sharon Dowie to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've seen the High Court impose 4-year custodial sentences for knife assaults that cause severe injury, permanent disfigurement and even requiring emergency brain surgery. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether, under her proposals, offenders convicted of crimes of this gravity could be released after serving only around 30% of their sentence? And if so, how can she possibly expect the public to have confidence in the justice system when judges impose 4 years only for offenders to be released after little more than a year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there is an underlying point that Ms Dowie makes, that it is important that people understand more about how sentences are applied in this country, and that if you are given a short-term sentence of just below 4 years, that you will have an automatic release point that is less than that sentence. So I agree with the point that more transparency around that and public awareness is needed. It is not the intention of this government to create a hierarchy of of offences. I mean, all offences have consequences for victims and communities. The reason that I am of the view that in this instance we can justify exemptions around violence against women and girls is because of the historic barriers to not reporting this, and given the progress that has been made as a result of growing confidence in the justice system, and we don't want to step back from that.
I call for McGregor to be followed by Katie Clark.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Evidence shows that those serving sentences of under a year reoffend nearly twice as often as those given a community payback order. So will this change announced today reduce recidivism in the Cabinet Secretary's mind, or do we need further changes to community justice, including more investment to stop the cycle of reoffending?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as has been repeated in this chamber, the evidence is very clear. Community sentences are far more effective in reducing reoffending than short custodial sentences, and that leads to fewer victims and safer communities. And that is why I have made it in part my mission to reduce this reliance on custody with increasing investment into community justice services, and the forthcoming budget has another increase and will take investment to £169 million. And again, it's important to recognise the evidence and the statistics. We have a total of 1,500 bail supervision cases were commenced 2024-25. That's the highest in 10 years, and the number of diversions from prosecution cases has also risen.
I call Katie Clark to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Only 2% of this year's budget for Justice and Home Affairs is assigned to community justice, and only 10% of that community justice budget is to be spent on frontline services, a real terms cut of 2%. Local government has also faced cuts of about 50% due to their budget since 2010 and are unable to provide the range of services. I know that the Cabinet Secretary and I have been in correspondence, but she must accept we cannot have cuts in real terms in this year's budgets to community justice, surely.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as was demonstrated at Portfolio Questions a few weeks ago, we have not cut budgets for community justice, and indeed, if I can be more specific, I'm sure I quoted a figure to Ms Clark that demonstrated that, for example, in terms of community justice, social work type services, that actually over several years, as a result of investment, the increase is in excess of 50%. I'm happy to provide that figure again to Ms Clark, but I cannot overestimate the importance of community justice in providing effective and robust justice that makes our communities safer.
I call Rona Mackay to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The numbers of those receiving short-term sentences of a year has remained stubbornly high despite the presumption against them. Does the Cabinet Secretary have a breakdown of those serving short-term sentences by year she can provide today, or do the Justice Committee ahead of the SSI?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, it is appropriate for me to recognise that the appropriate sentence in any given case is, of course, for the independent courts. And while there is a longer-term trend away from shorter sentences, a high number do continue to be imposed. And we are undertaking further work, for example, to better understand how the presumption against short sentences is currently operating. In terms of some most recent figures, 23 to 24, 73% of short-term sentences were for 12 months or less, and a further 15% were for 24 months or less.
I call Maggie Chapman to be followed by Otter Nicholl.
Thank you. In her statement, the Cabinet Secretary makes mention of the changed composition of the prison population, and that, when taken with the increasing prison population, this poses increased risks for prison staff as well as those serving sentences. Can you say a bit more about these risks, the current impact on staff and prisoners, and why the proposed changes she outlines are vital to ensure the safety and well-being of prison staff whose work is vital to reducing reoffending?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there is a very clear responsibility that the Scottish Prison Service has, and therefore ministers to both the health, safety and well-being of prisoners, but also to staff. We must recognise that prison is not the end of the line. The work that happens in our prisons, while often hidden, is imperative to the safe reintegration and rehabilitation of prisoners. And right now, prison staff need to know that collectively that we will pull together and that we will do the hard yards and make the hard decisions that they require from us to support them in their work that is vital to a frontline service, and it's a frontline service that has a direct bearing on the safety of our communities.
I call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last year's Prisoners Early Release Act requires a review of the operation of the reduction of the automatic early release point by this time next year. This is a really important part of post-legislative scrutiny. Therefore, will the Cabinet Secretary commit today to a review of the change being proposed this afternoon?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Ms Nicholl raises a very important point of detail. While the 2025 Act requires a statutory review of the operation of the reduction of the release point for certain short-term prisoners for 50 to 40%, the regulations, because they're secondary legislations, cannot create a similar statutory duty. But what I will do here and now is make a commitment that this Government will review the impact of changes proposed under these regulations. And this is vitally important because regular monitoring allows us to keep measures under review and also assess the impact both in the prison population and to the communities to which released prisoners are returning.
I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of the statement? It does appear that extraordinary emergency release has now become a routine tool for the Government in managing prison population. But in particular, we see a remand population that, as of 1st of January, I understand, is still over 2,000. So some of those even pre-trial. So what specific measures is the Cabinet Secretary taking to drive down a remand population that remains stubbornly and, I would say, unacceptably high?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do want to stress to Mr MacArthur that we most certainly are not normalising these shorter-term, more emergency-like measures. The reality is that when we need to take action that gives an outcome in the more immediate term, we have to do that. But the member is right that we've got to lift our eyes to the longer and more medium term for those longer-term solutions. And I can assure the member that we are engaged in that. And remand is a very important part of that work. However, 82% of remand prisoners are detained under solemn proceedings. 16%, however, are under summary proceedings, and then there's another 2% where it is the data is unclear. But the work around upside, for example, in terms of supporting those released from remand is important. But we have to continue, in short, Presiding Officer, building the work that we're doing in and around alternatives to remand, whether that's bail or supervised bail.
I call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary has outlined the actions taken to reduce the prison population over the past few years. Has the Cabinet Secretary been able to assess the impact on the prison population, and has she reflected on what the population would be if these changes had not taken place?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we have indeed done some of that analytical work. Justice Analytical Services worked very hard to track the impact of decisions and actions taken. What I can say is that if we had not implemented the short-term prisoner release programme, the otherwise known as STP40 programme, and the current early emergency release programme, our prison population would be an estimated between 8,780 and 9,010. So the action that we are taking does make a difference. The reality is, as I have always said, with each and every step that I've had to come to this Parliament with, it's not the end of the journey. There isn't one solution or one step. There are many, and we've got to be prepared to undertake this journey.
And I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary said in her statement that this would not apply to prisoners who have been sentenced to more than 4 years in prison because they pose the greatest risk of harm to others. Does she not understand that her government's policy of putting men who have committed murder in female prisons poses a great risk of harm to others? So why is this bizarre policy continuing here in Scotland, and why is her government in court today arguing that it should continue into the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, while I'm not going to comment on a live court case, I am going to get to the answer with respect, Presiding Officer, and with respect to the member. He will appreciate I'm not currently following the court case, which I believe is live streamed. But can I just perhaps reiterate evidence that I gave to the Criminal Justice Committee some time ago, evidence that the Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service gave some time ago around the current policy, and it's this, that no transgender woman with a history of violence against women and girls who present a risk of harm is placed in the female state. And finally, Presiding Officer,
Mr. Ross,
if I can just stress that as a responsible government we have to ensure that our policies comply with all of our legal obligations, including the Scotland Act, European Convention on Human Rights and, of course, the recent Supreme Court judgment.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the statement. We will now move on to the next item of business.